Let's go. Okay, thank you to everybody who tuned in live. Thank you everybody for coming. We are continuing our shir on tefillah. We're holding now in the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And with great rush, Baruch Hashem, I was able to put together a shir. There's never enough time, but we'll do with what we'll do the best. I'll do the best I can, B'ezrat Hashem. We are at the stage in the Siddur where if we, after the Akedah, which we discussed last week, we'll reach a period in many Siddurim where there's a new section which begins Le'Olam Yihei Adam, Yirei Shemayim B'Seder Kivagaloi. And as last week we discussed how the Akedah got into the Siddur, that there was a there was a recommendation by the Tur in the 13th century to say the Akedah every morning. And then later, in the time of the printing press, some printers had the brilliant idea to add a section of the Rosh Hashanah davening as an introduction as an appendix to the Akedah. And so that was really interesting, and we explored a little bit about the Rosh Hashanah Shmona Esrei last week. However, Le'Olam Yihei Adam is also an interesting tefillah, where how it got into the Siddur and how it became a part of the Siddur is a really interesting topic of study. And I'll begin with a little bit of that history, the history of how it got into the Siddur. The earliest source that we have for it in a Siddur is in the Seder of Amram. In many of the manuscripts of the Seder of Amram, it does have much of this entire section. The next, probably the next best location that we find it would be in the Cairo Geniza, in many of the Babylonian manuscripts, the manuscripts that follow the Minhag Bavli, those contain this tefillah as well. And then the Machzor Vitri, which is a Siddur from Rashi, from the school of Rashi from the 11th century. So many communities had the, what's it called? The custom to say this prayer. So what is this prayer? Let me share my screen for a second. Let's do this properly. Okay, my apologies. I'm going to minimize this. And I will share my screen to the tefillah. In case anybody doesn't have a siddur in front of them, we'll read this together. Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yirei Shemayim B'Seter Kibagaloi. ומודה על האמת ודובר אמת בלבבו וישכים ויאמר ריבון העולמים ואדוני האדונים לא על צדקותינו אנחנו מפילים תחננו לפניך כי רחמיך הרבים. Right, so the prayer begins that a person should always fear God in secret as he does in public, and he should confess to the truth and speak truth in his heart, and he should wake up in the morning and say, Master of the universe and the Lord of lords, it's not for our righteousness that we come and supplicate before you, but only for your great mercy. Hashem Shema, Hashem Salacha. Right, this is Tfilat Daniel. Ma anachnu ma chayenu ma chastenu. I'm not going to go through the whole prayer since many Jews are familiar with it, but as it goes through, he invokes the zechut of the avot, and then it says, and therefore, because we love you so much and you love us so much, it is our great privilege and honor and duty to say the Kriyat Shema every day. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Right, so this seems like it's designed around saying the pasuk of Kriyat Shema, and then it ends with Atahu Echad Kodem Shbarat Haolam ve'Atahu Echad La'achar Shbarat Haolam, which is a declaration of God's unity and God's oneness. This essentially is the prayer of Le'Olam Yihei Adam, Le'Olam Yihei Adam. So, as I said, it was the first place you find it is in the Seder of Amram, but many of the Siddurim of the Rishonim have it as well. It's clear that many communities throughout Europe and throughout Asia and the Middle East did say this prayer in their Siddur, but there was one notable exception. The Spanish simply didn't do it. So the Ashkenazim did it, the Egyptians did it, the Northern Africans did it, everybody did it besides the Ashkenazim. Besides the Sfardim. The Ashkenazim had the minhag to do the Berchot HaShachar, say Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yirei Shamayim B'Seder Kabagaloi, and then say Birkat Torah and then the Tamid. Everybody else had the minhag to do Le'Olam Yihei Adam after the korbanot. Okay, does that make sense? Everybody else did the Le'Olam Yihei Adam after the korbanot, while the Ashkenazim would do it before the korbanot and before Birkat Torah. The Tur himself didn't like this. He didn't like. He mentions in Siman Mem Vav saying Le'Olam Yihei Adam, which has pisukim inside of it, is problematic. You should say Birkat Torah first. So he moves Birkat Torah to before Le'Olam Yihei Adam. That's his opinion. And that's the evolution of that. But the Sfaradim, honestly, the true Spanish Jews never said Le'Olam Yihei Adam in their Siddur. It only entered the Sephardic Siddur with the advent of the printing press. Once we see the printers get their hands on making a Siddur, they're trying to please as many people as possible. And the Italians, as far as I know, also said Le'Olam Yihei Adam. So you find most of the Sfaradi Siddurim had Le'Olam simply because the printers thought, why not? Let's throw it in. They don't have to say it. They don't want to say it. They don't have to put it in. And the Ashkenazim, or anybody who does want to say it, the North African Sfaradim, somebody else, the Syrians, they'll use it. They'll say the Le'Olam Yihei Adam. So that's essentially how Le'Olam Yihei Adam got into the Sfaradi Siddur. Although the Ashkenazim have been saying it forever, the Sfaradim only began saying it about 500 years ago. Now, that might be the history of how it got into the Siddur. But the types, the nusach of the tefillah itself has not always remained consistent. One of the most famous examples is where it says Baruch atah Hashem bekadesh shemo berabim. Right. So originally, almost all the manuscripts had Baruch atah Hashem bekadesh shemo berabim, and this is attested to by the Ravia, one of the Rishonim in Germany. He attests to that. His version of this said it with shame, not with malchut, but with shame. Baruch atah Hashem mekadesh et shemcha berabim. However, many of the later sidurim, especially the Sfaradi ones, based on the influence of certain poskim, take out the Hashem part. They just say Baruch mekadesh shemcha berabim, because they don't want to say a bracha which isn't Talmudic. If the Talmud doesn't say to say this bracha, we shouldn't say this bracha every day. Okay, so that's essentially the history of how it ended up in the Siddur. Now let's make it get a little bit more interesting. The Sfaradi Sidurim will begin almost always Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yirei Shamayim B'Seder Kabagaloi. But many of the Ashkenaz Sidurim used to begin with Ribon Kol Ha'olamim Lo Atzedkotenu Anachnu Mapilim Tichonenu L'Fanecha. Why? Because according to them, first, they held, like one of the Rishonim, Rashi, who held you shouldn't say the introduction. Because if you look at it, it is an introduction, right? And then he should say, V'yashkeim v'yomar, and he should get up and he should say. So Rashi objected to saying this introduction. Why? Because, well, first of all, it's only an introduction, but second of all, Rashi didn't like the Girsah. It says, Yirei Shamayim b'seter, right? In their versions, they only said, Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yirei Shamayim b'seter, umodeh ala emet. They didn't have Kibbah Galoi. So Rashi said a person also has to fear Hashem publicly, not just privately. And therefore, Rashi preferred to start with Ribon Ha'olamim. And in fact, in many of the early Ashkenaz Sidurim, especially like the ones we saw last week. Let me make it. I'm not still sharing my screen, right? So I'll show everybody. Hope I can find this fast enough. From that last week we showed this Sidur. Let's. I don't know if we're going to find this fast enough. But last week we showed an Ashkenaz Sidur, a very famous one, where it goes straight into Ribon Olamim. Yeah, let me see if I can share my screen here, at least quickly. Yeah, there we go. Let's do this. Let me show you. It's a very fancy Ashkenaz Sidur that we showed last week. You see here? If you hear and then after the whole situation, right? Again, this is from the 13th century, the Sidur. You'll find the Birkat Torah and then the Tamid, right? You see over here where my mouse is. Then you have the Tamid. This is the old Ashkenaz custom, and they would not say, like the instruction of Rashi, they would not say Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yirei Shamayim B'Seder Kabagaloi. Okay, so that's some of the more interesting history of the beginning of it. Rashi had an objection. They sliced out the beginning. But now let's get a little bit deeper into the weeds. this is where the intrigue begins, and the legends of the story of the Le'Olam Yihei Adam begin. So the Shibbolei Haleket, I believe it's in Siman Vav. The Shibbolei Haleket points out this problem of Rashi. And one answer he says is that no, Beseter is Kal V'chomer Kibagaloi, right? Okay, it means Beseter, but of course a person also has to do it in public. But another answer he gives is, my brother Rabbi Binyamin, Ben Anav, right, his brother, says that the whole design of this tefillah looks like it's the relic of an ancient Sha'at Hashmad, a time when there was a decree. And because of this decree, this is why they said this prayer. So first, let me define the word for you. Sha'at Hashmad comes from the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says that the Gemara asks, why are we blowing the shofar in Musaf today? Why don't we blow it earlier in the day? So one of the suggestions of the Talmud is that it's from Sha'at Hashmad, the years of a decree when there was persecutions on the Jewish people. So let's open up with dissecting this idea of Rabbi Binyamin ben Anav. Now, his senses are good. Almost anybody who looks at the prayer of Le'Olam Yihei Adam, if you look at this, honestly, it's a beautiful prayer. If you look at just what the author of this prayer is saying, it sounds like he's saying that we have to conduct ourselves in privately and worship Hashem privately. We also have a mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, and we have to assert Hashem's unity even if we have a threat. And then finally, please save us from our plight, Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Shimcha B'Rabim, and we should be able to be Mekadesh, we should be able to sanctify your name in public. So let's go through how we can possibly verify this claim of Rabbi Binyamin ben Anav. So the first and most important thing to understand about Tana Deveil, about Le'Olam Yihei Adam, is that Le'Olam Yihei Adam is taken straight out of a medrash called Seder Rabbi Eliyahu. Seder Rabbi Eliyahu is sometimes also called Tana Deveil Eliyahu. It is one of the early midrashim that we have from Bavel. And its history is mired in mystery, but there's a fascinating Gemara in Ketubot, Daf Kuv Vav, which tells a very interesting story about a certain Amorah who lived in the time of Rav Nachman, named Rav Anan. So this is roughly in the end of the 3rd century. So there's this discussion about a din Torah, where Rav Anan tries to give a proper din Torah. He tries to do something properly so that a person isn't judged with shochad, and eventually it blows up in his face, and essentially something he did accidentally caused a problem where somebody was judged unfavorably. So the Gemara says a story about Rav Anan, a story that happened right after this judge Rav Anan made this ruling. What happened to him? Rav Anan haveragil Eliyahu da'atei gabe. Rav Anan was a very holy man, and he used to have Eliyahu Hanavi come to him and teach him. Seder de Eliyahu. He would teach him the Seder of Eliyahu. Kevan davad hachi. Once this incident happened where Rav Anan accidentally caused somebody to be judged unfavorably, istalak. Eliyahu Hanavi desisted from visiting Rav Anan. Yatev v'tanita. So what did Rav Anan do? He sat in fasting, ubay rachamei, and he prayed ve'ata. And Eliyahu returned, ki ata havim meva'et le ba'ute. But when Eliyahu Hanavi returned, he would terrify Rav Anan. In other words, Rav Anan was no longer on the level to receive Eliyahu Hanavi and not be nervous. The visions and the way that Eliyahu Hanavi would reveal himself to Rav Anan was in a terrifying manner, and he would appear in frightening forms. So what did he do? He made himself a box. I don't understand, honestly, I don't understand these forms of meditation. He made himself a box, and he would talk and learn from Eliyahu Hanavi from within that box. Until he finished learning from him. And that's what people say. Seder de Eliyahu Rabbah, Seder Eliyahu Zuta. This is why people call it Seder Eliyahu Rabbah and Seder Eliyahu Zuta. Seder Eliyahu Rabbah is the first section of this medrash, where he taught him when he was outside the box, and Seder Eliyahu Zuta is when he taught him from within the box. That's the second stage the midrash. So it seemed cut and dry, right? You look at this Gemara, and you think to yourself, and we're just looking at the Gemara here on Sefaria, but you could read the entire Medrash of Tana Devei Eliyahu yourself online as well. You look at this Gemara and you're like, wait a second, that's cut and dry. There was an Amora named Ravanan who wrote Seder of Eliyahu, Seder of Eliyahu Rabbah and Seder of Eliyahu Zuta. That's what it would seem. But many scholars, both religious, non-religious, Rishonim, Achronim, doubt that the Seder Eliyahu Rabbah that we have today in its book form is identical to the one here in the Gemara. There is even the possibility, which was raised by somebody named Tzachi Cohen, that over here where it says Hainu de Amri, this is similar to where the Gemara says Hainu de Amri Inshi, Seder de Eliyahu Rabbah, Seder de Eliyahu Zuta. Perhaps he says this is an expression that people say sometimes Eliyahu can teach you a lot, sometimes Eliyahu can teach you less, rather than the names of Midrashim, which is an interesting idea. But let me go through many of the theories as to who wrote Tana Devei Eliyahu. And I'm basing all of what I'm going to say tonight, of what I'm going to say now, on the work Mavola Midrashim. This is written by Anat Rezel. She's a scholar in Eretz Yisrael who wrote this book, Mavola Midrashim, is essential to anybody who ever learns Midrash. If you're ever going to learn Midrash seriously, Midrash Rabbah, any one of the Midrashim, Pirkei Eliezer, if you want to learn Midrash, you have to have this book handy in order to be able to see it, to get an introduction to every Midrash and who wrote it, when it was written, what parts of it were written when, and what we know about it. So she goes through in her chapter on Seder Eliyahu Rabbah, she goes through at least 5 reasons and probably 12 different opinions. I shouldn't say 5 reasons, 5 different, let's call it eras to, or opinions as to when the Seder Eliyahu Rabbah that we have today was written. So the first opinion, and this is perhaps a minority, a minority opinion believes that it was written in the early 3rd century, not by an Amora, Ravanan. Rather, these are the sayings of a Tana who was from Yerushalayim named Abba Eliyahu. Abba Eliyahu, when we say Tana Devei Eliyahu, according to this opinion, I think it's Moshe Margolius who has this opinion, maybe a few other Rabbanim also hold this way. I think it was Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport. I can't remember. There's a few shitas this way, that it's not Tana Devei Eliyahu of Eliyahu Hanavi. Rather, the first opinion is that this is Tana Devei Eliyahu. The version we have today, the Sefer, is from the Beis Medrash of Abba Eliyahu, one of the Tanaim, who was from Yerushalayim but moved to Bavel to teach Torah. That's the first opinion. The second opinion is that this is it. This is from the late 3rd century, from Ravanan in Bavel, and the copy we have today is more or less essentially what he had, plus or minus, a bunch of deletions and additions throughout the generations, but the core text really is from Ravanan. And again, this is important because if the entire text of the Tana Devei Eliyahu is this old, then that means that this prayer, Le'Olam Yihei Adam, Yirei Shamayim B'Seder K'Bagaloi, is as old as the 3rd century, the early or the late 3rd century, which would make it a very, very, very old prayer. Now, the language of Tana Devei Eliyahu, I should say, doesn't really totally support that. The language is unique. It's very interesting as far as Midrashim go. The one thing that these two theories have going for it is that, I should say the second theory has going for it, is that unlike many Midrashim, if you look at many Midrashim have this feature that the Medrash, when you read it, sounds like a compilation of many different scholars, many different sayings, and many different parts, right? If you open up a Medrash Rabbah, if you open up a Sifrei, if you open up a Sifra, when you study the Medrash, you'll notice that it doesn't seem like there's a singular author. There's a singular compiler. There's definitely an intelligent design. There's definitely one person compiling. They call it the orech, or the person who's compiling it. But an author, not really. The only Medrash, besides perhaps Pirkei Eliezer, that you could say feels like there's an author is Tana Devei Eliyahu, because Tana Devei Eliyahu has a speaker, and it's written in the first person, and he has his own way of writing. And it's very much an independent creation. So for all intents and purposes, saying that it was written by a single person is an attractive proposition. And almost everybody believes that it was definitely written at one time or compiled at one time by a single pen. And there is a voice of almost a single author, of a single author speaking. The next theory is the one which is the most important for our discussion, which is that it was written in the 5th century in the Sasanian Empire under the rules of Peroz or Yezdegerd, right? Okay, and then we're gonna the last two is that it was written in the 9th century Bavel or Italy, based on the content and the fact that there's a polemic inside of it that looks like it's a polemic with the Karaim. There's different references to different empires inside of it that seems like it might be contemporary. And lastly, there's another theory that it's as late as the 10th century Bavel, or that it was written either in northern Mesopotamia or it's written in the Seleucid territories, which is, again, it's exhaustive and everybody has a million different rides. There's even a theory that the core text, the Ur text, was written in the 3rd century by Rabbanan, which is the halachic section, and all the whole Aggadic section, the part which has Agada, was all written in the 9th century. So there's tons of opinions. Many scholars have a whole, there's at least a dozen different, wildly different opinions as to who wrote Tana Dev Eliyahu. Now, the reason we're discussing the origin of it, of course, is for, well, who wrote Le'olam? Who wrote Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yirei Shamayim Kibasei Kivagaloi? So this is why number 3 here is really, really important, and that is because there's a couple of scholars. There was one in Germany. Forgot his name. There's the Tikkun Tefillah, of course. The Tikkun Tefillah was written by Rabbi. What's his name again? I always forget his name, the one who wrote the Tikkun Tefillah here in the Eitzer Tefillahs, right? This is the famous Sefer Eitzer Tefillahs. So anyway, the Pirush Tikkun Tefillah, he believes, as well as Yaakov Man, who wrote an article in 1927, as well as a couple scholars in Germany, they believe that many of the persecutions and many of the Gzeres mentioned in the inside the Tana Dev Eliyahu are specifically Persian persecutions. So let me give you just all a little bit of background into what the Persian Empire was and why it was important. So when the Jews first moved to Bavel, right? When the Jews first moved to Bavel, they were, for the most part, a lot of that area was under Parthian control. However, at the time of the Talmud, as the majority of Jewish scholars moved to the centers in northern Mesopotamia along these rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates over here, the Parthian Empire began to crumble. What essentially happened was that the Parthians were great warriors, but they didn't believe in centralization of government. They liked when, you would war. They liked basically splitting up the empire and letting each place have their own governor and each place have their own noble family. And they would often fight, and there was often a lot of internal fighting. Now, the Parthian Empire was what modern day Iran, and the Persian people were an incredible people. And there's tremendous amount of diversity in Iran. Iranian history is very complex and very diverse and very colorful. There's a lot of different areas in this region, from northern Mesopotamia all the way down into what we would call today, Iraq, Iran and Iraq. So this empire, the Parthian Empire, was overthrown by a house, one of the noble families in the south, the House of Sasan, and they began over here, down here, where my mouse is pointing. And eventually, because the Parthians decided that civil war was smarter than crushing the rebellion, the family of Sasan basically rose up and took over the entire empire. What was great about the Sasanians is that they understood the centralization of government. They were terrific government officials. They understood how to build roads, how to communicate, how to sponsor the sciences and sponsor universities, and to bring scholars in. They built an empire which not only rivaled Rome, but also almost crushed Rome. The Sasanians on more than one occasion almost crushed the Roman Empire. So the Sasanians were basically, the Sassanid Empire was basically the ruling empire during the time of the Talmud. Some of the kings were great for the Jews, and some of them were terrible. The Sasanian kings ruled at least most of them ruled under Zoroaster or Zoroastrian, the Zoroastrian religion. Now, this is kind of how it worked. in order to really understand the Persian history of this time, you got to think outside of the kings. The kings were just puppets. Let's be real. The kings were always elected by the most rich and noble families of Iran Shahar, of the region, which was the Sassanid Empire. The rich and noble families and the priests, they always consider themselves like they were like the inheritors of the Parthians. The Parthian state was very Hellenistic. It brought in a lot of Greek influence, and they were the smartest, and they were the richest, and they considered themselves the elite and the inheritors of the power in Persia. So, let's call it Persia. And from their perspective, the king was somebody they chose to be the figurehead and to execute what they wanted. And the kings who did what they wanted lived. The kings who didn't do what they wanted all died. So the king is always really like a puppet. And when it comes to, even though the kings had their own power, historically, the kings of the Sassanid Empire that focused on internal development and internal livelihood did much better than all the kings who went on pointless, wasteful wars, needless, wasteful wars in the West and in the East. So there were golden eras to the Sassanid Empire. In many of those golden eras, the Jews thrived. And in many of the dark eras, of course, they did not. So during times of religious, let's call it zealotry, they did not just persecute, let's call it the Magians or the Mazdak or all the other, the new Zoroastrian heretics, so to speak, but they also, of course, persecuted the Jews because they were trying to bring an iron fist down on anybody who was not purely Zoroastrian. They would sometimes bring down their wrath on the Jews as well. One of these kings, his name was Yazdegerd, and I'm just showing the slide here. By the way, this beautiful illustration is done by Epimetheus. He runs a very famous channel on YouTube, which does a lot of history, a lot of world history. So it's a lot of fun. It's cartoons. If anybody wants to, please check him out. Anyway, let's go a little further here. The next slide. One of these kings, his name was Yazdegerd. Now, this is here pictured as a coin of Yazdegerd II. Yazdegerd I is mentioned in the Gemara with Rav Ashi. Yazdegerd I was a chill dude. He knew Torah, and he was apparently like a real friend of Rav Ashi. I don't remember the story offhand. Mamish didn't have time to go look at the story again with Rav Ashi. But Yazdegerd II was much, much, much worse. He as well as Peiruz, who was called like Peiruz Harasha, him and Peiruz essentially brought down a whole bunch of decrees on the Jewish people, which made their lives very difficult and did a lot of oppression and persecution. Some of the Jews rebelled, some of the Jews were killed in turn. There's a lot of history here, and a lot of this history is recorded in the Gereter Shvira Gaon. The Gereter Shvira Gaon is a historical document which was written by the office of the Yeshivot of Bavel. It was sent to Kairouan. What's important for our discussion is these persecutions of Yazdegerd II. It is well documented in many of the Gaonic sources that there was a time when the Persians outlawed the recitation of Kriyat Shema. They outlawed not only the recitation of Kriyat Shema, but also the observance of the Shabbat. Now, the funny thing is that they couldn't really enforce not observing Shabbat, because if you think about it, much of observing Shabbat is not doing things. So a guard can't come really to your house and say like light a fire. It wasn't really enforceable to force Jews to not keep the Shabbat. But when it came to not saying Kriyat Shema, the legend has it that at least as attested to in the Gaonim, that the guards knew that the Jews had to say Shema up until the third hour of the day. So they would send guards to the Beit HaKnesset to make sure that no Jew was saying Kriyat Shema, or that the Chazan was not saying Kriyat Shema up until the third hour, and then the guards would leave. For this reason, according to the Geonim, they added in Musaf of the Shabbat, they would add Keter Yitunu Lecha. They added Shema Yisrael into there in order to remind the people of the chiyuv of saying Shema Yisrael, because by the time they were saying Musaf, the guards had already left. It was past the third hour. So many scholars saw these persecutions of Yazdegerd, and they're like, oh, of course, if there was a persecution where they weren't allowed to say Shema Yisrael, this must be the time when this tefillah was composed. And therefore, Le'Olam Yihei Adam is a prayer written by the rabbis of that era, who were undergoing the suppression, and they wrote a special prayer for all the Jews to say at home. And the Jews would take this prayer, say it at home, and they would say within the prayer Shema Yisrael Shem Elokeinu Shem Echad. And then when they would get to shul, they would skip Shema inside the regular davening. This was the theory. It's also interesting to note that in the I should say in the Igeris or Shiragon, it says that Yazdegard II met his end, or I think it was Yazdegard II met his end after 5 years of these Gzeres, because Marbar of Ashi led I think it was Marbar of Ashi led a whole Kihila. They fasted and they prayed to end the Gzera, and the Lashon of the language of the Gerter Shiragon is that a snake bit him in his sleep, that he died from some sort of serpent. It's not clear if it's just an Aramaic expression, like perhaps one of the nobles backstabbed him, but yeah, he died. And with his death, and with eventually the death of Peroz as well, those specific Gezerot were ended. It wasn't, I think, until the 500s that there was a golden age of the Sasanian Empire. Okay, but well, that's the theory, and this theory is echoed. The Yazdegard is the man, Yazdegard is the reason, and it's echoed many times. And if you look even in the Art Scroll Siddur, they bring this theory from the Tikkun Tefillah and from Yaakov Man. So the problem with this, of course, is that all of this rests its power. All this entire theory rests its power on the very idea that Tana Dev Eliyahu was written in the 5th century under the Sasanian Empire. However, there's at least 12 nuanced opinions as to who actually wrote Tana Dev Eliyahu and when it actually was written. We can't just cherry pick 2 pieces of data, take a sewing needle, put it between them and say, okay, this is what happened. We don't know for sure. It is very reasonable to us to suggest that the purpose of Le'Olam Yihei Adam was written b'shat hashmad. It just has the internal information. It does seem internally, the content does seem to indicate this story, but we can't assert that. One of the scholars of liturgy, Ismail Elbogen, he believed that the story wasn't true at all. He said that he believed that it's not impossible, but it's more likely that the whole reason they put this in here was only for people who are going to come late to shul, or people who are going to say too many piyutim and they weren't going to say Shema Yisrael on time, so they put this whole tefillah here and instead. That's really not as probable in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others. It's not a very probable opinion. Jacob Mann also points this out. This is just not a very probable opinion. And especially because you could just do it other ways. You didn't have to do it this way. It's based also on a manuscript from the Sefer Ha'itim. I'd recommend, if anybody wants to look this up, there's a brilliant article by Yaakov Man. It's called Changes in the Divine Service of the Synagogue Due to Religious Persecutions. It's available on JSTOR. Very interesting article. It's an easy read, and it's lots of fun. He himself believes, of course, in this Yazdegard story, and that this is the reason for Le'Olam Yihei Adam. Regardless of who wrote it or when, this can't be taken as fact. It is a beautiful idea. It's something that we can suggest, but it's not something that we can, of course, establish. We can't establish this with any certainty because we just don't know. We have a range of 700 years. Was it written in the early 200s? Was it written in the late 900s? We don't know when Tana Dev Eliyahu Rabbah and Tana Dev Eliyahu Zuta was written. Okay. And of course, if anybody's a history buff, do look at Mavo Midrashim, and there's a bunch of pages there on page 346 onward. It's worth reading on Kotar, if you could get a copy yourself. Okay, the last bit of history. Let me just share my screen here. I had a slide of Yaakov Man, who died in 1940. Okay, the next interesting bit of history here is the Baruch HaMakadesh Shmei Barabim. So, as I said earlier, this idea of saying a bracha that's not brought in the Talmud is disputed by the Poskim. Now, Rav Shimon Schwab, in his Sefer on Tefillah, which is called in English Rav Schwab on prayer, right? And it was in Hebrew, it was Iyun Tefillah. He says that in Europe, he heard a story, he had a tradition, that this bracha received very unique treatment from the Gra, the Le'Olam Vilna. There was a famous Ger Tzedek of Vilna The Ger Tzedek of Vilna is a story, and if anybody's interested, Schneier Lyman, professor in Torah, or Landers, I believe, Professor Schneier Lyman has a class on the Ger Tzedek of Vilna. It's a famous person. Some people know him as Avram ben Avram. And the story behind this is that there was a person whose name, I think he was born Valentine Potocki. He was one of the Potocki family. This is the Potocki Palace in Poland today, pictured here on the screen. The Potocki family was one of the richest, most powerful noble families of Poland. And he was born into this family. He went to Catholic school. He was brought up Catholic, and then he met a Jew, and it all went downhill from there. He essentially started to read Hebrew. He started to look more into Judaism. Then he was conflicted. He went to Rome, studied Catholicism more, and then decided he could not stick to Catholicism. He had to convert to Judaism. So he moved to Amsterdam, and he disappeared. His family couldn't find him. Eventually, the story goes, there was a tailor who overheard that this certain guy was in town. He snitched, and the family found him. So now the family found him, and they were, of course, bereft that their son had converted to Christianity. And this is, I believe, as the story goes, that as the story goes, they jailed him and they tried to force him to convert back to Christianity, and he refused. And then they burnt him alive and commanded nobody should take his ashes. So before he got burned alive, there was a lot of politics, and the Gaon of Vilna was involved. And this is brought even only 6 years later by, I think, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He also mentions the story. So again, an interesting story, but one of the versions that Shimon Schwab heard was that the Gaon of Vilna told Avram ben Avram, this ger, he told him that I have the ability to get you out. Like I could bribe somebody, or some versions of it say he could have used Kabbalah, magic, or something to get him out of his predicament. But he preferred to dial Kiddush Hashem. And he composed a song, like a niggin, a tune, to the words of Le'Olam Yihei Adam. I believe those were the words, if I'm not mistaken, which he composed a song to, like a niggin. And he asked the Vilna Gaon whether or not he should martyr himself, and it's a very interesting story. I recommend anybody who wants to look it up. Look up the Ger Tzedek of Vilna. And the legend that Rav Shimon Schwab heard was that he asked him if he could, what he should say, what tefillah he should say when he was dying, and the Vilna Gaon told him to say Le'Olam Yihei Adam Shemayim B'Seik V'Galoy, and to end with Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Mekadesh Shimcha B'Rabim. That this is the bracha that you should say if you're dying al Kadesh Hashem. Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Haolam Mekadesh Shimcha B'Rabim. I'm not aware. Again, this is why I would have wanted more time before the shiur, and I apologize. I'm not aware of an official bracha that one has to say if he is going to die al Kiddush Hashem. Historically, many Jews have said Shema Yisrael Shem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, but apparently there's this legend that the Gaon of Vilna believed that a person could say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Mekadesh Shimcha B'Rabim, and this would be his bracha for dying al Kiddush Hashem. The ashes of the Ger Tzedek of Vilna were purportedly buried with the Vilna Gaon, or next to the Vilna Gaon, and then when they rebuilt his caver, the Vilna Gaon's caver, after World War II, they opened up a monument right next to the caver. I believe it's this black one over here, which is for the Ger Tzedek of Vilna. I should say one last thing. Let me just switch slides here. Let me move that. Okay, I'm going to stop my share. Give me a second. I'm going to go all the way back here. Sorry about that. One last thing I wanted to mention was that the printing of this Tana Devei Eliyahu that I showed you today is the printing of Sifra de Zekukin de Nura Biurin de Asha. And as I said, there's many different versions as to who wrote the Tana Devei Eliyahu, but this version has a pirush called Sifra Zekukin de Nura Biurin de Asha. And it was written by a certain Rabbi Shmuel Haida, and he published it in Prague I think it was 1676. He published it posthumously. He was a Mikubal who lived in Europe, and that's basically all we know about him, that he published it in Prague. and that it was published in 1676 after his death. He writes in the introduction that the manuscripts that he had of the Tanna Devei Eliyahu were very, very corrupt, and he didn't have many of them were missing many parts, and he couldn't understand all of the portions of the Tanna Devei Eliyahu. So he said that he fasted and he prayed, and Eliyahu Hanavi came to him in a dream and helped him figure out and helped him rewrite the manuscript of the Tanna Devei Eliyahu. So this absolutely incredible idea that Eliyahu Hanavi himself would have written or assisted in the publication of this Tanna Devei Eliyahu. And he says that because I didn't want covet for myself, I decided I would publish this only after my death. He didn't want anybody to think that, oh, he's such a big tzaddik, that Eliyahu Hanavi comes to him. So he decided to save the manuscript and have it published after his death. So that's the amazing story of this version of the Tanna Devei Eliyahu. And if anybody wants, it's on Hebrew Books. You could look up the version of Le'Olam Yihei Adam over there yourself as well. I'll end with one interesting nugget of thought. In the Siddur Hagra, they ask a very obvious question. This is something that's always bothered me, and I just wanted to the cover page, by the way, if anyone's interested, on the slide here, that's one of the Sasanian kings. We just don't know which one. They're all the same. All right, they're all dead. That's Dar Darba. Every king rises and falls. But anyway, in middle of the Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yerushalayim B'Seidek HaGoloi, it says, Adat Yaakov bincha b'chorecha she'me'avatecha she'ahavta oto, mimsimchatecha she'samachta bo karata et shemo Yisrael v'Yishrun. Ever since I was little, I had no idea what this meant. I didn't know what the significance of this was. Okay, we're the assembly of Jacob, your eldest son, that from your love of him and from your joy of him, you called him Yisrael and Yeshurun, right? The two names of Klal Yisrael. I don't know what any of that means. Like, what is the significance of the name Yisrael? What is the significance of the name Yeshurun? So in the Siddur Hagra was the only commentary I ever found where somebody addressed this. I think it was in the bottom by the Siach Yitzchak on the bottom. I could be wrong. I have to pull it out again. I didn't have enough time to look it over. But he says something fascinating. He says that if you look at the names of the Malachim, all of the Malachim which come from the Tzad, from the side of Chesed, they come from the Tzad Yamin. They all have their names ending with Kel. Michael, Gavriel, Raphael, Ariel, all the names of Malachim which are from the side of Yamin, from the Sitra Yamina of Chesed, that are their job is benevolence. Their names end with Kel. But those all of the Malachim whose purpose is Sitra Dismala, which is Gevura, and their purpose is destruction or limitation and restraining Chesed, all of their names end with Vav Nun, like Metat, Mem Tet Tet Reish Vav Nun, right? One of the greater Malachim. So in the Kabbalah, Ahava usually refers to Chesed, Simcha usually refers to Gevura, and therefore Me'ahavatcha, and if you called him Yisrael, Misimchatecha, from your Simcha, from the side of Gevura, meaning when Hashem speaks of Klal Yisrael in the language of Chesed, he speaks of them as Yisrael. When he speaks of them in the language of Gevura, meaning when Hashem has to punish Klal Yisrael, he calls them Yeshurun. And depending on how late this Tanna Devei Eliyahu is, again, I can't escape the Kabbalistic understanding of this. I can't see it any other way. Ever since I saw this pshat, I can't see it any other way. And it begs in my mind, when was this written? Like, this must be the solution, right? This must be what he's saying. Whatever the author is saying, Le'olam, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't see it any other way. So I always want this bugs me. This part of the entire Le'olam bugs me as to, is it really, like, this is the Kabbalistic interpretation? And if so, how old is this text? Is this really from Rav Anan? Is this really from Eliyahu Hanavi? Because that would be absolutely incredible, at least for me. Anyway, that was Le'Olam Yihei Adam Yerushalayim B'Seidek HaGoloi. That is a review of the history. I wish I had more time to review this, but unfortunately, with Rosh Hashanah in between, I didn't have time to recheck every single source. I hope everyone will forgive me for that. Next week, I don't know if we'll have time at all to do another a shiur, maybe, God willing, but with there's Yom Kippur in between, and then everybody's busy preparing for the Chag. So if we don't give a shiur, then k'tiva v'chatima tova to everybody. And if anybody has any questions, I will pause the recording and maybe we'll continue if need be.